Around 1300 BC, a single ship went down off the coast of Turkey. When divers finally reached the wreck, its cargo held goods from at least 11 different cultures: Cypriot copper, Baltic amber, African ebony, Egyptian gold, and the oldest glass ingots ever found. One sunken ship proved the ancient world was already connected in ways we never believed. Start on the bottom of the sea, 50 meters down off a steep rocky headland called Uluburun, on the southern coast of what is now Turkey. It is dark here, cold, the kind of place a human body is not built to be. A diver's lamp cuts through the gloom, and the light falls on something that should not be here. A row of flat metal slabs, shaped like the stretched hide of an ox, lined up along the slope. Hundreds of them. They are ingots of raw copper, and they have been lying here, undisturbed, for more than 3,000 years. This is the wreck of a late Bronze Age merchant ship. It sank around 1300 BC, before the Trojan War, before Rome, before the reign of Tutankhamun's successors had fully faded. When it went down, it took its entire cargo with it. And that cargo, sealed under the sand, waited in the dark while empires rose and fell above the surface of the water. For 33 centuries, no one knew it was here. Then, in 1982, a young Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Çakır surfaced with a strange description. He had seen, in his words, metal biscuits with ears. Those metal biscuits were oxhide copper ingots, and that offhand remark would launch one of the most important underwater excavations in history. But the copper was only the beginning, because when archaeologists began to lift the cargo piece by piece, they realized this was not one nation's shipment. This was the ancient world's entire trading network, packed into a single hull. To understand why this wreck matters, you have to understand what was inside it. The excavation was led by George Bass, the father of underwater archaeology, and his team from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. Over 11 seasons, from 1984 to 1994, divers made more than 22,000 dives. They mapped the site grid by grid, and they brought up the ancient world one artifact at a time. The copper came from Cyprus, around 10 tons of it, cast into those distinctive oxhide ingots. Alongside it lay about 1 ton of tin. Copper and tin melted together make bronze, the metal that gave the age its name. Just this cargo alone held enough raw metal to arm a small army. Then the glass, nearly 200 discs of raw glass, deep cobalt blue and turquoise. These are the oldest intact glass ingots ever discovered, the raw material that Egyptian and Mesopotamian workshops melted down to make beads and vessels. And then it gets stranger. There was ebony from Africa, logs of dark, dense wood the Egyptians called by a name we still echo today. There were ostrich eggshells, likely destined to be carved into ornate vessels. There was ivory, from both elephant and hippopotamus, tortoise shells, spices and resin sealed in Canaanite jars. There was amber, and this is the detail that stops historians cold. Chemical analysis traced it to the Baltic. That means beads of fossilized tree resin traveled overland, hand to hand, from the shores of northern Europe, all the way to the eastern Mediterranean, across an entire continent, in the Bronze Age. Count the origins: Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa, Mycenaean Greece, the Baltic, Mesopotamia, Anatolia. At least 11 distinct cultures, all represented in one hold. But whose ship was it? And where was all of this going? That question would turn out to be even harder than it looked. Among the treasures, the divers found gold, and one piece of gold changed the way we date the entire wreck. It was a scarab, a small carved beetle, the Egyptian symbol of rebirth. Nothing unusual about that, except for the name inscribed on it. The scarab bore the name of Nefertiti, the queen whose face is one of the most recognized in all of antiquity. It is the only gold scarab of Nefertiti ever found, and because we know roughly when she lived, it helped anchor the date of the ship to the late 14th century BC, give or take a few decades. But here's the deeper point. That scarab was not fresh from the workshop when the ship sank. It may already have been an antique, changing hands, carried across the sea as a prized object long after the queen herself was gone. The ancient world was not just trading raw copper and tin, it was trading art, status, history itself. Alongside the scarab lay gold jewelry, a golden chalice, and a collection of the strange and the personal. There were weights for a merchant's balance scale, carefully calibrated to more than one regional standard. The tools of someone doing business across borders. There were writing tools, and even a hinged wooden object that may be the oldest known book, a wax-covered writing tablet that once held erasable notes. And there was jewelry that seems to belong to individuals aboard, a scattering of personal seals and beads. Someone wore these. Someone owned them. This was not an anonymous cargo. There were people on this ship, with names and origins of their own. And when it went down, they went down with it. So who were they? To answer that, the archaeologist turned from the treasure to the humbler objects, the everyday things people only carry when they mean to keep them. You can learn more about a ship from its garbage than from its gold. Scattered among the cargo were personal items, the pottery people cooked in, the tools they used, the small gods they prayed to. And these tell a mixed story. Much of the everyday gear was Canaanite and Cypriot in style, pointing to a crew from the Levantine coast, the merchant heartland of the eastern Mediterranean. But there were also two sets of items that looked distinctly Mycenaean, Greek. A couple of swords, some spearheads, seals, and drinking cups in the Aegean fashion. This has led many scholars to a careful conclusion. There may have been Mycenaean Greeks aboard as well, perhaps passengers, perhaps envoys, perhaps merchants of a different nation traveling with the shipment. Think about what that means. On one small wooden ship, you may have had a Levantine crew, Mycenaean travelers, cargo owned by an Egyptian or Cypriot palace, and goods gathered from a dozen lands. This was a floating microcosm of a connected world. And the destination? The mix of goods, the fine finished pieces, the huge stockpile of raw metal, the diplomatic-grade treasures, suggests the ship was sailing westward, counterclockwise around the Mediterranean, quite possibly headed toward a Mycenaean palace in the Aegean. This may have been a royal shipment, a gift, or a trade delivery between kingdoms. We will never know its exact port of call, because it never arrived. Somewhere off that rocky Turkish headland, in weather or in darkness, the heavily loaded ship struck the slope and slid into the deep. But its loss became our gain, because in failing to reach its destination, it preserved something no successful voyage ever could, a perfect, sealed snapshot of a single moment in the ancient economy. Here is why the uluburun wreck rewrote the textbooks. For a long time, historians pictured the Bronze Age as a patchwork of separate kingdoms. Egypt over here, the Hittites over there, Mycenae across the sea, trading occasionally at arm's length in luxury goods for kings. The picture was of isolated islands of civilization. The uluburun ship shattered that picture, because this was not a trickle of royal gifts. This was industrial-scale commerce. 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin is not a present for a king. It is a bulk shipment, a supply chain, raw material for making bronze on a massive scale. The precise merchant's weights, calibrated to multiple standards, tell us this was routine, organized, professional trade. There were systems, there were markets, there were people whose entire lives were spent moving goods across the sea. The amber from the Baltic, the tin that may have come from as far as Central Asia or beyond, the African ivory, the Cypriot copper, the Egyptian gold, all of it converging on one hull, proves that around 1300 BC, the ancient Mediterranean was the hub of a trade network that stretched across most of the known world. The Bronze Age was, in a very real sense, already globalized. Goods, ideas, art, and technology flowed between cultures that we once imagined as strangers. A merchant on that ship would have handled objects made by people who spoke a dozen languages and worshipped a dozen gods, and thought nothing of it because it was simply his trade. Which makes what happened next almost unbearable to consider, because this connected, humming, prosperous world was about to vanish. Within roughly a century of this ship going down, the entire system collapsed. Around 1200 BC, the late Bronze Age world came apart. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean burned. Great powers, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean palaces, fell and did not rise again. The trade routes went dark. The very idea of a connected, cosmopolitan sea faded from memory, and much of the region slid into what scholars call a dark age. The world the uluburun ship belonged to, that intricate web of copper and glass and amber and gold, simply stopped. And when it stopped, we forgot it had ever existed at that scale. For 3,000 years, the true reach of Bronze Age trade lay buried, quite literally, at the bottom of the sea. That is the strange gift of this wreck. A single catastrophe, one ship, lost on one bad night, became a time capsule. Because it never reached its port, it never unloaded, never scattered its cargo into the ordinary churn of history. Instead, it held everything together, in one place, in the dark, until we were ready to understand it. One ship, 11 cultures, a lost economy, preserved by the very disaster that destroyed it. When George Bass's divers switched on their lamps 50 meters down, they were not just looking at copper and gold, they were looking at proof that the ancient world was far larger, far richer, and far more connected than anyone had dared to imagine. The uluburun ship went down carrying the whole world in its hold. And in sinking, it saved that world for us to find. If this changed how you see the ancient past, subscribe. We reconstruct a lost world every week.